Good evening or good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are joining in from the world. It is my absolute pleasure to talk with you about my book, Lessons from Plants, that came out earlier this year. Um, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the book, but I thought it might be interesting to actually also share the path to the book because, as you heard from Martin, I'm a biochemistry professor primarily. And this isn't a normal path for a biochemistry professor. At best case scenario, perhaps a retirement project. But the path to writing this Lessons from Plants has been and continues to be one that started very early, has had lots of twists and turns, but I thought it might be a little bit fun to share. So interestingly enough, I was exposed to plants very early. My mother has a beautiful green thumb and grew up with dozens, if not hundred more plants in the house, and certainly many, many plants outside in her flower and vegetable gardens. And most summers, many summers in my youth, I remember summer adventures with one of my sisters and one of my brothers, the two closest in age to me. We'd get up in the morning, do whatever chores had to be done, and my mother would pack us up a lunch and send us off, and we'd have just a day-long adventure. And despite her having sent us with the sustenance that we needed, we were fascinated by the things we could eat that we would find. And there were these beautiful wild blackberry patches that my brother and sister and I would encounter. And once we described to my mother that we were indeed using these blackberry patches as supplementation, we had to have some cultural learnings because she knew that also growing in those spaces were wild poison oak. And so she wanted to make sure that while we were enjoying these wild blackberries, we weren't causing some kind of problems for ourselves and for her by getting into poison oak. Now, we were very good at spotting poison ivy and staying away from that. Or the unlearned eye could look similar to wild blackberries. They usually are yellow or pinkish or red. But she really did want us to be able to distinguish those. And so I remember one of the things she and some of her friends taught us, she had friends who would look in on us as we passed by their houses, was that if there are three, let it be. And so the poison oak often had three leaves on its stem, where if you look closely, wild blackberry much more likely to have five. And so we started having these cultural learnings about plants early, but they really were learnings to help us navigate safely as opposed to trying to really cultivate junior botanists, as I would say. What was interesting is that I was really observant even as a child. And I noticed that the poison oak, when it was growing next to the blackberry, the leaves were also a little different than if it was growing in isolation. Almost in a way, you had to be super careful to pay attention to the way the environment was really causing us to have to distinguish between what was good for us, wild blackberries, wildly delicious for us, and what could have been a real problem. So in addition to this, my mother, as I said, had beautiful gardens and she had honeysuckle bushes in the front of the house. And so early, my sister and brother and I also had a sweet botanical discovery when we realized that there was some really nice sweet nectar that we could use as a sweet treat from those. And so we would often, sometimes to her ignoring us, sometimes against her better wishes, pull her honeysuckle bushes and get the sweet nectar from those. So I was surrounded by these plants and they were an integral part of my childhood, certainly parts of my memories. But when I really was thinking about what I was going to study, plants weren't even on the radar. Early in life, I had decided that I was going to be a lawyer. It's a very long story, but I felt that I needed to sue a neighbor at one time. My parents wouldn't hire me a lawyer, and I decided I would become a lawyer. And then through doing aptitude tests, it was confirmed that law was good. And then probably when I was preteen, it was clear that I was really drawn to and excelled at math and science. So I started to pursue math and science, but still was really committed to becoming a lawyer. And so ultimately, even though having some people suggest maybe engineering, I decided to meld my science interests with my law commitment very early and thought I would be a biological patent lawyer. So I went off to undergrad studying biology and math, but really focused on this pre-law program so that I could go off to be a biological patent lawyer. And late, actually, in my undergraduate studies, I decided that I do some hands-on experimentation in a laboratory. And at this time, it wasn't with any idea that I might become a practicing scientist or a scientific professor, but I really wanted to understand the steps and the processes that are a part of experimentation so that when I was writing the patents, I would be a good patent lawyer working with scientists who were seeking to patent their inventions. Well, once I got into this lab and spent more time with the professor and realized that this was a career of curiosity, I think about, where in my estimation at that time, perhaps from naivety and now through still optimism, for me, a scientific career as a professor is you really getting to think up the questions that interest you. And if you're able to convince a few colleagues to sign off and recommend you for funding, you can be funded to really pursue your curiosities. And a great part of that was also the opportunity to work with students and mentor students so that students such as me might have opportunities to really experience hands-on experimentation to see if that was something that they wanted to pursue as a career, or at the very least to go off in other careers, whether it's law or politics or other careers in the civic and professional spaces with scientific knowledge, which I think would benefit all of us greatly. So ultimately, I decided that I was going to pivot away from going to law school after having been really committed to it, admitted, and all of that. That was a long and deep conversation with my mother that took several years to resolve. But ultimately, I decided I would pursue a career as a professional biologist. And having really come to that decision, I hadn't had any idea what I would pursue in terms of advanced or graduate studies because I wasn't planning to go. And so I decided to engage in a wide range of biological topics to get a sense of what might really interest me in terms of a focus. And I worked for a while. I did some work with snakes in the field, did some ecological studies, some studies with muscle regeneration in mammal systems. But ultimately, I took a class. Several classes, but it was the plant physiology class that excited me more than I expected to. And it's really serendipitous because I remember signing up for that class because it fit a convenient hole in a schedule of classes I wanted to take to decide where I would be really focusing in graduate school. And I was fascinated with this idea that, you know, even though I had been growing up surrounded by plants and a mother dedicated to plants, I still thought at that point plants were quite boring. And this plant physiology class really flipped that notion on its head for me. So after having had this class, I did indeed pursue graduate studies in plants. And one of the first phenomena that I investigated professionally as a student was the phenomenon depicted here. And this is a phenomenon I have been fascinated with since the time of doing those hikes out in nature with my family when I was young. And this is this phenomenon that some trees, this particularly oak trees and other deciduous trees, when they have leaves that emerge in spring in some bushes, these leaves are transiently red. And so the young leaves are red. And then after a couple of weeks or whatever short period of their life cycle, they transition into the green and larger leaves that we recognize. And so I've been really fascinated with this and had an opportunity to study this as one of the first projects, real plant physiology projects that I was involved in. And at that time, the professor that I was working with and I had a hypothesis that perhaps these red pigments, which are anthocyanins, were accumulating transiently in these leaves as a screen against UV light. And so we know that mature leaves have waxes and other surface that help screen out adverse exposure to UV light. But these young leaves, before they've synthesized those waxes and other compounds, need a way to protect themselves. And so we hypothesize that these may be serving as a sunscreen of sort. There were other competing hypotheses that these may be a deterrent to some insects or herbivores who are not attracted to red. And so we really did set about trying to understand this. And so these were some of the first experiments that I actively engaged in. And I was really fascinated with this idea that the plants are paying close attention to the seasonal cues, responding accordingly, but only putting energy in that for the time it's needed. And after that's needed, no longer the energy goes into other processes such as maturation of the leaves and synthesizing the waxes. So after that, I started to study another process as I was working on my doctoral studies. And I saw this picture the very first week of my graduate studies for the PhD and have been fascinated with this phenomenon for over 25 years since. So this may seem like a very simple picture to you, and you may ask, why is this something that would fascinate someone for so long? But what fascinated me about that then and continues to fascinate me about this picture now is that these are two genetically identical seedlings. For all practical purposes, they are twins. they've been exposed to almost identical environments. They've had the same amount of water, the same access to nutrients. They're planted in the same soil. They're at the same temperature, humidity, any number of factors that you might think about are quite similar. The difference between these is one critical factor. And that's that this seedling that's tall and white with the yellowish looking cotyledons or infant embryonic leaves has spent its entire life cycle in dark. In darkness, plants are actively searching for light because light is critical for them. They need light to use to conduct the process of photosynthesis, the process by which plants use relatively simple compounds, carbon dioxide and water, in the presence of light. And that light is used by the chlorophylls to start a chemical reactions that lead to what we call fixing that carbon into a carbohydrate form or sugar form that can be used by the plant to support its life cycle and reproduction. So, in the presence of light, all things being equal, access to this critical factor of light allows the plants to transition from searching for light, where they're actively growing tall in a search for light, to really putting their energy into developing leaves, greening, which is due to the development and accumulation of chlorophyll and chloroplasts, and really being in a state where they're able to use their leaves as the equivalent of solar panels to harvest sunlight and use that sunlight in the case of plants to drive this process of photosynthesis to make sugars. And so I was completely fascinated by the idea that a single critical factor could completely change what an organism, the phenotype of the organism, what the organism looks like. But not only the phenotype in terms of what it looks like, but what its metabolism and what it's capable of, being capable of photosynthesis, or instead, basically putting your energy into a search for sunlight. And so I've always said that the thing that fascinated me most about this is that humans don't do anything quite this striking. Certainly, we can adapt to some environmental changes, but we don't do anything nearly as striking as this, which is known as developmental or phenotypic plasticity, where these organisms are able to change completely. They have a plasticity or a dynamic nature to their phenotype, depending on what the external cues are. And so I was really fascinated by that and have spent a number of years trying to understand the real biological and biochemical processes by which the presence of the light cue is perceived by the plant and how that leads to changes that really result in these very different organismal states that we see here. And so the picture that I've shown you here is a bean seedling. It's very photogenic. It makes for a beautiful photo. We actually study an organism in the lab, which is unfortunately, I think, known as a weed. I say unfortunate because I think often we think of weeds as plants that are just bad plants, but they really are plants that are growing in places and spaces where weed prefer they not. So they just have a bad reputation. This particular plant, Arabidopsis thaliana, occurs in ecosystems worldwide. We know we've sequenced even 1,000 ecotypes of this particular plant. It is very well used in plant sciences for a number of reasons. One of them being that it's a very small plant. Small plants means that we can grow lots of them in relatively small spaces in laboratories. It also has a relatively short life cycle. In most cases, it can go from seed to full maturity and producing its own seed in roughly 30 days, depending on the ecotype. And so this is very amenable for doing a number of studies. And it also has genetic tools, which are tools that we can use in the lab to ask questions about particular things, but then also to test whether our hypotheses about how, for example, it responds to light are actually occurring. And so again, you see here that there's this difference, all things being almost equal. In the absence of light, plants put all of their energy into elongating rapidly in a search for light. In natural context, this would be a seed germinating in the soil. And so growing tall would allow it to propel itself out of the soil into sunlight as rapidly as possible. In the presence of light, plants actively inhibit putting energy into elongating that stem and instead develop the leaves and the root system. The leaves for harvesting light, the root system for taking up water, nutrients, and other required compounds that are needed to support the life cycle of the plant, and directly also some of those needed to support the process of photosynthesis. So we think of this as behavioral adaptation that's driven by an energy budget. And this is a common principle that organisms face. For plants, this is driven in many cases by access to light or nutrients that are needed to drive, again, photosynthesis. But humans, we also have behavioral adaptation that's driven by different budgets. For most of us, it's a fiscal budget. We also are driven by our energy budgets, but we tend to ignore our syncing with the environment, unlike other organisms. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So if we really understand this as behavioral adaptation driven by an energy budget, that's the sense that plants have a certain amount of energy under certain conditions, and then the plants have to make molecular decisions. These are decisions driven by which genes are present, which genes are active, which proteins are being produced, which really drive the plants towards one behavior versus another, depending on what the external conditions are and what their energy budgets are to support behaviors in those particular conditions. So what we and others know from studying these processes over the years are that plants are able to distinguish many different kinds of light. Plants can see basically all colors of the rainbow in terms of the visible spectrum, and some wavelengths that are quite outside of the visible spectrum. So we do know that plants are very potently able to perceive blue and red light, and we see very distinct behavioral responses, although there are some reports as well that plants can also have some responses to green. So what we know is that there are families of proteins called photoreceptors. Photoreceptors, you get to hear all the Latin derivatives because I studied Latin for 4 years. I don't remember why, but I learned a lot of Latin derivatives. So phyto is plant. Photo is light. Photoreceptors are light absorbing proteins. So they perceive light. And in response to having perceived light, there's some change in the protein activity. Some of these proteins are enzymes, which means that they actually operate on one compound to convert it to another. Some of them are other factors that simply change which genes are active. In terms of photoreceptors, we know that there are 3 major classes of photoreceptors that can perceive different colors of the rainbow. And so there are phytochromes, phyto being plant chromic proteins that can absorb red light and far red light. We know that they absorb red light because these are the proteins that have been shown to have a very important role in terms of whether seeds germinate or not. And if many seeds, if they're exposed to red light, that promotes germination. And if it's far red light, which is just at the edge of the visible spectrum, similar to infrared, they do not. And so these are the proteins involved in that. There are 2 families of proteins that absorb in the blue region to let plants know whether blue light is available and indeed how much blue light is available. These are cryptochromes and phototropins. And then there are photoreceptors that actually do perceive whether there's UVB light available. And these are the ones that we know most recently in terms of scientists having identified them and starting to study them. For today, what we have to know is that together these families work together to give the plant an integrated sense of which light is available, how much red, blue versus UV is available, and what that means in terms of where they are in physical space and time. And then that information is used to drive many different aspects of plant life, from the seed germinating to deetiolation, which is simply that process of difference between seeds that are in dark versus light, all the way to whether it's time to flower, which is known as floral induction, and ultimately whether it's time to transition into old age and accept the possibility that the life cycle is over, which is senescence. There are other responses, many of you are aware of them, whether you're plant biologists or not, that are controlled by these photoreceptors. And that's whether a plant's bend towards the light or not. So many of you have plants in your home that if it's growing in a part of the house where light is coming from one direction, that plant will start to bend. That's phototropism. And that's the idea that, again, light is critical, essential for plants. And so they will bend themselves to make sure that they still have access to it. And so in my laboratory, we've been very interested for a number of years in phytochromes, which are primarily controlling responses in this red region. And I'm not going to go into details, but what we know, we and many other labs over the years, are that there are signals that are perceived by plants, either dark or light. And depending on what those signals are, the photoreceptors that I've described to you, the phytochromes, the cryptochromes, they perceive light and they either send a signal to plant that, yes, a certain light is available. And so you should have red behavior because red light is available or blue light is available. And all we have to know is that in the absence of light in the dark, there are a certain set of genes and proteins that accumulate and drive the actual behaviors that we see through a hormone-mediated process where plants will initiate growth. So much like we know in the adolescence of humans, hormones initiate tallness, there are hormones that will initiate elongating of the stem if in the absence of light. When blue, red light, or other light conditions are perceived by photoreceptors, different genes are active, different proteins are accumulating, and we get the responses to make leaves, to make chlorophyll, to green, and to be prepared for photosynthesis. So basically what we've been asking are which genes are active when there's no light, which genes are active when there is light, and how does that actually translate, often through protein-mediated responses, to the behaviors and the aspects of plant growth in terms of greening or lack of greening that we know are associated with one condition versus the other. So we've been studying this for years, continue to study this. And basically, it's a very simple paradigm that plants are in an environment. In that environment, they perceive what's going on around them. I happen to study light. They also can perceive temperature, nutrient availability, and many other aspects of the environment. Once they have perceived the environmental factors that are abundant, they then modulate the networks of genes and proteins that are used in those cases that allow them to have the appropriate outcome, the appropriate behavior, the appropriate development of organs and tissues so that they can thrive in those conditions. And so even as we've continued to think about, all these things that we've learned about plants, the path towards lessons from was really driven over the years by me being embedded in a family where I'm the only plant biologist, in fact, the only professional scientist in my direct family, and really wanting to explain in many ways why and how I have dedicated so much of my life, my time, my energy, and mind space to really trying to learn more about plants. And part of that has also been trying to translate what I've learned about plants into accessible language. But in addition to translating these into accessible languages, also engaging with them from a life principle of reciprocity and really asking, over all the time that I've spent learning about plants, have I learned anything from them? Plants have been on the planet for a very long time. Many of them, apart from some of the human interventions, have had very long lives and very adaptable lives. And so I really interested over the years, personally, what can I learn from plants, but also what can we learn in community from looking to other organisms for insights into persistence, existence, and thriving on the planet. And so really one of the things that this same picture, I really have been obsessed with this picture of bean seedlings for many years. In addition to this picture serving as really great fodder for thinking about hypotheses, scientific hypotheses, and questions that we want to ask. This picture has really served very powerfully for me to think about how to be in community, how to be a mentor, how to be a leader, and the real importance of understanding that environment matters. And that goes back to the fact that I described to you that these two plants are genetically identical, which means that genetically they have the same aptitude. And yet what this picture powerfully demonstrates, and what the experiments that we and others do demonstrates, is that equal aptitude can result in vastly different outcomes depending on the external environment. And so the lack of access to a critical factor in this case results in a seedling having a very short life where it's only able to elongate and grow as long as it has energy that was packed for it in the seed by the mother plant. Whereas this particular organism, all things almost being equal, getting access to a critical factor, is able to transition into independence and is able then to use the external cue of light to make its own energy and really drive long-term success and thriving. And so this idea that we understand in the biological world, and this is true not only for plants, people who study animals and others understand the importance of nutrition and other factors, that aptitude really thrives in understanding how the external environment is providing access to or limiting access to critical factors that are needed for these organisms. And so I've thought a lot about this general principle that I just laid out for you about plants in a light environment, being in that environment, having to perceive which light is available, adequately and accurately modulating the gene and protein network so that they can have successful outcomes. And I've looked at this in parallel to the ways in which we often engage with each other in community. And for me, I started thinking about this in the context of my work, which is in higher education and academia. And so I did start asking this question about how do we actually engage with students, trainees, and colleagues? Although I think there are great parallels to thinking about this also in the ways in which we engage in our social and cultural communities and contexts. But what I have really observed to be the predominant ways in which we engage students, those we're training, or our colleagues, is that we often start through a deficit-based induction lens. And that's the idea that we look at the outcome, we look at their behaviors, we look at their processes. And so if it's the student, we look at whether they're scoring high on exams, whether they're having the highest grades in a class. And if they do that routinely, we assign them as being a high achieving or smart student. If we have students who are routinely struggling in terms of their ability to perform on exams or to perform in hands-on experimentation, we make some judgment about that. And often we decide that they're not good enough, they're not smart enough. We look at the deficits that individuals have in these cases. We often look at individuals through biased lenses. So we will often look at what kind of socioeconomic background they're from. Are they from certain racial or ethnic groups? Are they from any number of ways in which we look at biases? Often, if it's a particular discipline such as physics, we will have questions about whether women perform well or not. And so really, we look at the outcome and make a judgment about the individual and often assign deficits or biases if they're not performing routinely to the standards that we would say. And then in some cases, we will decide that these individuals can and should have mentoring. But even when we do that, when we offer advising or mentoring, we are much more likely to do that through a lens, an assimilation-based lens. And what I mean by that is that we make assumptions that the environment is good and that we simply need to teach those individuals how to have success in the environment. We rarely ask questions about whether the environment needs to change. We ask them to assimilate into a context that we have assumed is good or worthy of supporting all. And ultimately, if there continues to be questions about their performance, we often will just say that they're not a good fit for the environment. We rarely ask the question of whether the critical factors are there to support them. And so I've really been looking at this, and it flies against the face of everything that we know to be true. And so one of my first assessments was that individuals such as me who study plants and how the environment influences them, we should be some of the best mentors because we understand the importance of the environment for promoting success, even when individuals start with relatively equal aptitude. And so I've been looking at that and realized that despite that kind of assumption, plant scientists, like many other higher education practitioners, struggle in terms of engaging individuals through a deficit-based lens. And so for me personally, I really started to ask, how could the inspirations that I draw from plants be used to promote what I think of as assets-based or growth-based mentoring? And that's the idea that we expect that individuals can have some success as opposed to judging the outcomes and deciding whether we think they're successful or lacking. And I've been inspired in this, process, not for individuals such as me who are plant practitioners. But I've been inspired that the human condition by and large is that the majority of humans engage with plants from a default expectation that plants should grow and be healthy. And we see that because if we do quizzes with humans and show them pictures such as these and ask them what's going on with this plant on the far left of my slide versus this plant towards the middle, they will look at these two plants and they will often say that this particular plant may not have enough access to water. It may have been overwatered. It may be too cold. It may be too hot. It may be in the office of someone who is neglecting it and not a good caretaker. We generally ask a lot of questions about what the plant is lacking access to in the external environment because our default expectation is that it should grow. Likewise, if I show a picture such as this particular one in the lower right for me, This plant that has leaves in the middle that are yellowing, if you show this to individuals who do grow plants frequently in their homes or are gardeners, they will often recognize that perhaps this plant has a nutrient deficiency and either needs access to supplemental nutrients, or perhaps it's being overwatered, which is leaching the nutrients from the soil. The point is that they think about what's lacking that's allowing the plant to green. Few people look at this plant and say, oh, those are simply leaves that are incapable of greening, have a deficit and are incapable of greening. So what we generally do when plants are not faring well are to ask a number of questions, numerous questions about what's lacking in the external environment, and or admitting that perhaps the person who has responsibility for caring for the plant does not possess good caretaking abilities. And so when I thought about this, it really inspired me to think about the ways in which this could serve as motivation for us rethinking the ways we mentor and teach, because we would never try to teach these plants to be better plants. We would ask questions about the environment and the caretaker. And so I really think that there are lots of lessons that we can learn from plants about how to be better mentors, leaders, but also how to be better collectively in community. And so I did write a paper in 2018 that came out in the Public Philosophy Journal that really did draw about half a dozen specific mentoring lessons that I thought we could learn from plants. And this was one of the first pieces that I wrote that was really in the lessons from plants genre, and is indeed covered in a chapter in the book in terms of caring for others. And I won't go through all half dozen of them today, but I'll share a couple ones that are also explored in detail in the book Lessons from Plants. And one of those is that we probe the environment first and extensively when our plants aren't faring well. And I think that that's a real mentoring implication, in that if we have students and colleagues who are struggling, we often, as I said, go straight to personal deficits and ask about the personal deficits. And I think that our engagement with and mentoring of individuals in our communities would be well informed by our practices with plants, to ask questions first and systematically about the impacts of the environment on the potential for individual success. Another lesson is that with plants, we recognize that caretakers and their specific preparation and expertise matter to plant persistence and optimize survival. So I shared with you that my mother has a green thumb. And in fact, my mom could take care of almost any plant. She's a good observer. She tests and she tries mediations. And growing up, friends of hers who were not good caretakers of their plants would bring the plants to her and say, can you nurse this plant back to health? Share with me what you did so I can learn and do better. And I think that one of our mentoring implications, it has to be that mentors and leaders matter greatly, just like plant caretakers, in supporting the success of individuals. And if you have two individuals of equal aptitude, the individual that's connected to the right mentoring resources or embedded in the right network is much more likely to succeed. And also the potential for success and mentoring outcomes are supported greatly by the efficacy of the caretaker. And we are often hesitant when there is a mentoring relationships that's struggling. We often blame the student, the person being mentored. We are less likely to ask questions about the efficacy of the caretaker, although we know this to be absolutely important in other contexts. And so I've really thought that we need to move away from these deficit-based transduction models towards things that we know play out again and again in nature. And that's the idea that individuals are in an environment. They have to be able to perceive that, modulate their networks to lead towards intended outcomes. And so I really believe that we can transition from doing this deficit-based transduction and engagement to stewardship-based engagement. And I've shown it here in a science context, but as I said, this really applies across so many contexts. And that's that individuals in a particular environment have to perceive what is available in that environment that can be really readily helped by having access to stewards. I think of as mentors and leaders as environmental stewards who help them understand that, and then also support them in building the networks of cultivation that they need, developmental and mentoring support networks that lead towards specific outcomes. So I've written about this and other aspects of what I believe we can learn from plants. There's a chapter on cultural change. There's a chapter on diversity. There are many other chapters. And one of the reasons I was really impressed to write this book is that over the years, as I've shared some of these lessons from plants that have been impressive for my own individual life, but also in community, it's really led me to this idea that many of us sit with a wealth of knowledge. So I've been sitting with plant biology knowledge, and certainly it's been in scientific papers. It's helped students graduate and move towards successful careers, helped me advance in my own career. But some of this knowledge that we have really is unapplied to asking questions about how we are thriving and surviving on the particular planet. And so I did release this book earlier this April. And one of the things that I really think of is that the book, it really explores a number of plant growth inspired life lessons. And that is really founded on the idea that I myself, in addition to looking at plants as a study subject, have really come to understand them as teachers. Robin Wall Kimmerer, a plant ecologist, an indigenous scientist, has said that plants have been on the planet much longer than us. And many cultures understand that they then have wisdom for us based upon their long-term persistence on the planet. And that if we are willing to be good students, they can certainly serve as good teachers. Plants also serve as witnesses of our lives. And for me, I live in a place where we have truly the four seasons, where in spring, plants are emerging, new leaves are emerging on trees. Those move towards summer, where although it looks like the plants are just mature and sitting there, summer is a period of very busy time where those leaves are actively harvesting light, making sugars to support the plant, but also storing those sugars in some compounds, in some structures, and also in some storage capacities. And, as plants move from summer into fall, they start to prepare for fall, where here for us, fall is a time where the temperatures are dropping. There will be less access to light. And so they really are transitioning and anticipating a period where they will move into complete rest in the middle of winter. And winter is a time of rest. And so every year, as I'm looking at these seasons of spring, summer, fall, and winter, I am continuously reminded that plants are actively aware of what's going on around them and timing their behaviors and their decisions about molecular decisions about their lives to that. And too frequently as humans, we don't do that. Too frequently as humans, we exist as if we're in all out summer all the time, as if we have access to as many resources as we need to continue to grow and robustly be active throughout the season. And I think too frequently we don't have that anticipation of fall, where we are actively anticipating that rest is coming. We're actively preparing for it. I think that what I've learned about myself and other humans is that too frequently we are forced into a state of rest. And certainly, I think many of us have learned what it means with this global pandemic over the past year or year plus to be forced into a state of stopping. And I've really tried to each year use plants as witnesses for the wisdom of timing your life to the season and repacing your life to the season, anticipating the changes and moving thoughtfully into those changes that are forward. So I have really thought, as a part of writing this book, I explored a number of lessons. I think there are still lessons that are remaining for me to learn. And I hope that that's part of what the book accomplishes. It's for others is reading it to certainly learn about plants, but also to ask what lessons remain for learning, whether it's with plants or other engagements or knowledge that you have. For me, there are lessons both for the personal and my professional life. And in the pandemic, one of the most deeply personal lessons that I learned was related to the role that plants can really have in terms of companionship and hope. And I think many of us have seen this. Plants have certainly taken center stage in a lot of ways during the pandemic. I think there was an uptick in the growing of house plants globally. There was certainly an uptick in the sharing of that on many social media spaces. But I personally had some very personal interactions with plants during the pandemic. My father passed away in October of 2019, just before the pandemic. And in processing the grief of that, through the end of 2019, I really was just in a state of pause with many of my professional activities, trying to process that, and had slowly started to get back into the cycle of my life, which is traveling to do talks, traveling to discuss science, actively being engaged in writing and other pursuits. And I had just really started to get back into that at the beginning of 2020, largely to honor that I knew that's what my father would want me to do, to move forward in life, to honor him through living. And so I was just in the middle of getting back into that when March 2020, the pandemic hit. And so I was literally stopped in my tracks and grounded at home as I was continuing to process that. And in November of 2019, I had planted some tulip bulbs, and that was right in the middle of my grief. And I planted, of those bulbs went into the ground with thoughts of my father. Some of them went into the ground with tears induced by the grief. And so after I had been grounded in March, as the temperature started to warm, one day I emerged from the house and those bulbs started to emerge from the. And it just reminded me, in the middle of all of the uncertainty that March 2020 held for me personally and us globally, for the loss that we were all experiencing, the great loss of lives that we experienced globally due to the coronavirus, and my continuing to process my personal loss. I really was reflecting on the loss of my father. And as these tulips emerged, it was this really strong lesson for me of how, even in the face of uncertainty and loss and change, life has to keep moving forward. And so I would emerge each day and the green leaves would come out and ultimately the bulbs emerged and were in full bloom. And it really became this powerful lesson. These bulbs reminded me that despite the challenges of loss of life for me personally and for us all globally, plant life was tracking on. And I think that part of this great relationship that humans have with plants is that humans do have this connection to for another. Plants are certainly something that all of us can bring into most of our spaces, whereas we can't always bring in animals or pets. And so really, I think that plants have served as inspiration for personally, but they've also been powerful mentors for me in terms of my professional life. And so I really have tried to think about the lessons that I have personally learned from plants and the ways in which I use that information about their resilience, which was a help for me personally, but also about the ways in which they adapt and are very plastic and dynamic in being able to monitor the external environment and to use that information to really position themselves to be successful and to thrive, to ask how I can use that information to nurture my scientific community. And I think we really can look to the natural world for ideas about how we nurture a thriving scientific community. And the biggest of this is to really enter into our engagements in these particular spaces with the same way humans enter their engagement with plants. And it has been transformative for me to enter into spaces expecting growth and success. And when that growth and success comes, to celebrate it. And when it doesn't, not to move to faulting the individual, but to truly ask questions about what stewardship can we have over what's going on in the external environment that's much more likely to move us towards success. And so I think, the thing that, as I'm drawing to a close with my time here with this discussion, that I want to bring up is that I've had lots of amazing conversations with individuals who've read the book or who have just simply encountered this phenomenon that I am fascinated with, the idea that plants can serve as teachers and witnesses, and that there are powerful lessons from plants that we can learn. And I think there's an increased awareness after engagement with some of these topics. But the thing that I'm really fascinated with now is, once you have increased awareness of these ideas, once you understand the power of engaging from a growth perspective and expecting growth, the question is not, will you be fascinated with those ideas? Many of these papers that I've written about mentoring and leadership, I've often said, I didn't write those for the citations. If you use them, cite them. That's good citation politics. But more than anything, the conversations around lessons from plants is always, for me, and I hope for others, an invitation to ask, once you have increased access and awareness of specific ideas, what will you do with them? And in this context, I have been powerfully just thinking about and wrapping my head around this idea that many of us have been faced with inequities, the impact of inequities in terms of health inequities, as we look at how the global coronavirus situation rolled out, that there were some countries hit much harder than others, even now that some of us have access to vaccines, whether that's equitable or not. And also in the US and some in terms of global context, the conversations that we've been having about ongoing racism. And so really we've had the opportunity to learn a lot in the past couple of years. And so we have an increased awareness of some of these topics. And my biggest fear is that this awareness is only going to lead us to the pursuit of a better inequality. And I personally have made a strong stance and a strong commitment that I can no longer commit to better inequality as a goal of victory. I really long for the collective commitment to move from these espoused commitments to change inequity to lived commitments. And I like to share this quote whenever I talk about this, because this quote from Imani Perry, a professor at Princeton, has really powerfully impacted me. This is a quote from one of her recent books, Breathe, a Letter to My Sons, in which she says, awareness is not a virtue in and of itself, not without a moral imperative. And so I invite all of us to continue to increase our awareness, but we have to be willing to also really ask and assess what moral imperatives are and our moral commitments are to see those go from espoused to lived commitments. So I would just like to end, if I could, by saying that this is Black Botanist Week globally. We have committee members across the globe, and we have been celebrating diversity in botany. Please join us online in the conversation about this. It was inspired by Black Birders Week last year and founded by the lead founder, Dr. Tanisha Williams. But we'd love to have you join us in conversations about plants throughout this week and beyond. And I would just like to thank you again for the invitation to be here, and I welcome any conversation or discussion.